no pen, look more, no hands, look more, no frame, no shame. Numb me up like cocaine, can't focus, shaky can. Which moment makes a man? 'Cause I'm hoping it just begins.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Robert Groves, your host for the Groves Connection podcast. The Groves Connection brings you intimate conversations with pundits, providers, patients, leaders, and laypeople, all to help us understand a contradiction. How can our healthcare system be both magnificent and yet so deeply flawed? We're going inside healthcare to talk candidly with those who know. What they have to say may delight, surprise, frustrate, or at times even anger you. But I invite you to get curious and listen to the truth about healthcare and those who want to fix it. Maybe the answers have been there all along. We just need to make the connection. Are you ready to connect? Dr. John Mandrola, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to get a chance to talk to you. There's so many things that I want to get into in this conversation, not least of which is your extensive presence on social media and the message that you're getting out there. And we'll talk about that later, but I want people to get a feel for who they're talking to. And so I want to start in elementary school. Where'd you grow up? What was life like for you? What were you thinking then about your life?
Sure. I grew up in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, which is about halfway between Hartford and Springfield. I grew up on the same yard, really, with my grandparents who were from, second generation Italian, and so they helped take care of us, and we walked to school, and it was kind of idyllic. And my wife always says that I was cursed by having a near perfect childhood. So it was good. And, went to school and kind of was a B student and didn't really apply myself. And my guidance counselor, he took me in and he asked me, what we wanted to do with our lives. And I said that I wanted to be a doctor. And he sat me down and he said, John, he goes, you really have to be smart to be a doctor. And I really don't think you're smart enough.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Yeah, Mr. Pappas in Windsor Locks. And he really, really inspired me, kind of made me mad. And I went to college and applied myself. And I found out that if you study, well, school's not that hard. And so that's kind of how it all went down.
Now, his intention was not to inspire you, I'm guessing. His intention was...
I don't actually know what his intention is, but I've always had this thing where people say I can't do something. I've always feel a little bit inspired to do it. I think it's kind of a cardiology phenotype.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like to make generalizations, but we sort of feel like we can do stuff that maybe people think that we can.
You say you don't like to make generalizations. I don't like to either, evaluate each person on their own merit, but there are definitely personality types and specialties, and it holds true over and over again. Not for everybody, but as a general rule. So that's interesting. Critical care docs have their own personality type as well. So how did you make the decision in high school about where you were going to college?
I'm really grateful to my parents. They really supported me and took me around, and I ended up going to a small liberal arts college in New York called Hobart and William Smith College. I visited, I liked it, and another thing happened there that kind of flipped my life is that when I got there, I met a roommate, Jack Fabian, was from Southern Connecticut, and he took me to the biology conference on a Friday at 5:00. And I said, Jack, let's just go out. Let's have some fun. He goes, no. He goes, we're going to go to this conference. And it was kind of where seniors would present their research and what they were doing. And we went. I thought, this is going to be boring. And then, this was in the 1980s. And the professor, after it was finished, rolled out a big cart of beer. And we just had a big old party. Of course, the drinking age then was 18, and it was all fine. And I was just hooked on biology from that very moment. And
you know what? I want to put in a plug for small liberal arts schools. I went to a small liberal arts school myself, a place called Center College in Danville, Kentucky. 900 total student body.
It's my state.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was one of the most formative experiences of my life. And one of the reasons is I got to participate in so many things. I lettered in soccer, which I was not skilled to the level that a large school would have had any interest in me at all. And I was able to participate in student congress and so many things that I would not have had the opportunity in a much larger institution. So I understand that draw of a small liberal arts college. I really do.
Yeah.
When was it that you decided that you were definitely going to medical school, and how'd you prepare for that?
Yeah. So when we were studying, we were really deep into the biology department, and to be honest, their medical school wasn't really encouraged. We were encouraged to be biologists and to love biology for the sake of biology. And so I had actually gone that route and interviewed in PhD programs. And at that time, cell biology and molecular biology was in its infancy. And I actually had I had housing at a graduate program in biology, done my GREs, and I came home from the summer, and my dad said, John, he said, why don't you just apply to UConn as a backup medical school, just in case you change your mind. And so I did, and I got waitlisted, and I filled out more, and then, UConn sent a letter, about, I think it was in July or whatever, said, you've been accepted. And so at the last moment, I called up the place that I was going to graduate school, and I said, I'm going to medical school. So I really had planned to become a basic scientist in a PhD program, and changed at the last moment.
You know what? That's really interesting. And I think it speaks to one of the reasons that you have so much interest in the scientific method and the meaning of the scientific method, which physicians don't often get when they're on the pre-med track. They don't think about it.
Yeah.
And that's to our detriment as a society, unfortunately. But we'll get into that a little bit here. So what was did you go, when you were in medical school, looking at specialties, that whole thing? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I went to UConn, and UConn was a great experience. The first 2 years are in the classroom, and actually UConn had been ahead of its time, and it had a pass-fail system, and I think that that worked fine. And then we started our rotations, and I just got interested in cardiology, and that was the era of we just started to learn how to do a little bit more for heart attack patients. When I first started, I think we were just basically giving him bed rest and not much. And then as I went through UConn, the thrombolytic era came into play, where we were using the clot busters. And it was such an exciting time in cardiology. So I would be on my medicine rotation at say, Hartford or St. Francis Hospital, and I would sneak away to go run around with the cardiology fellows in the CCU, and then I got, in medical school, I got really, really interested in cardiology, and I in sort of the medicine track, and that's what I knew I wanted to do that, and that's kind of how it all happened, because it was such a great time to be in cardiology.
That was absolutely the golden age of cardiology. And I remember cardiology being on the forefront of having really good studies that proved the value of what they were doing. And it was really astonishing, because in critical care, we were still kind of muddling around and trying to figure out what to do and when. And I was a little envious, of my cardiology colleagues, because they had evidence, and that was the golden age for evidence in cardiology, wasn't it?
It really was, and I think I as you know from following me, I can be fairly critical of some of the science and an interpretation of science, but I have to give cardiology credit. We really been our field has been a leader in evidence generation and using evidence to guide practice. So that was part of the draw too, right? That we had trials and we had journal clubs. And
do you think there's been some drift from that?
I don't know. We do a lot of trials, and we've made so much progress that we're getting on this flat part of the curve where people cannot live forever, and it's really. One of the challenges of modern day cardiology is not can we do something, but should we do something? And we're our endpoints used to be mortality, and now we're looking at more surrogate endpoints, because it's hard to show differences in mortality because we've already made such big progress.
Yeah, no, that's a great insight. And I'd not thought about it specifically that way, but I can absolutely see that point of view. So now you're in medical school, choosing a cardiology fellowship. How did you do that? Where'd you go?
People in Connecticut were staying in the East Coast, and I needed to get out. I kind of saw this time as a time to just explore a different area. And I really loved basketball, and I really loved the Midwest, and I loved the movie Hoosiers. And I just thought the Midwest would be where I wanted to go. And, my dad and I, it's like an epic trip. We just took this journey in a station wagon across the country, and we interviewed at the big programs, the big internal medicine programs. As you know, you have to do internal medicine before cardiology.
Yep.
So I interviewed at Ohio State, at Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Case Western, all of these big, Minnesota, all these big places. Of course, Indiana had a number of leaders in cardiology. It was a big cardiology place, Doug Zipes and Charlie Fish and Suzanne Noble. And so I figured that the best way to get into the Indiana cardiology program would be to be an internal medicine resident there. And so that's how it went down. I drove a Nissan Sentra across the country, and had a little apartment, and that was all she wrote.
I get a little twinge of envy when I think about that trip across America, looking at programs. That must have been a really fun time for you and your dad.
Yeah, it was funny because you would go interview, and my dad would go mess around in the town, and then I would come back to the hotel, and right before dinner I would type out my thank you letter, and then we'd send it into slow mail, and then we'd drive to another place. Yeah.
Now you're at Indiana. You finished your internal medicine. You've doubled down on cardiology. I'm guessing you had that in mind the whole time in internal medicine.
Yeah.
But before we move on from that, was there a particular focus in the lab in cardiology that you pursued? Or?
So the first 2 years of my cardiology was general cardiology, cardiac cath, these kinds of things. And but then, I had these mentors. I really was interested in reading EKGs and the electrical part. And I had these mentors who were, amazing teachers in electrophysiology. Doug Zipes was there. And I just decided that I loved electrophysiology, and the timing of it was that this was the beginning of the catheter ablation era. That our EP docs had gone to Oklahoma to learn from Sonny Jackman, who was an IU fellow, and so they had just come back, and this was the heyday of catheter ablation. And I just fell into it.
Yeah. It is often missed, at least in the lay population, that the advances in cardiology have not been solely about the circulation, that the electrical system, unbelievable advances in managing problematic arrhythmias in the last, decade or two.
Some of the things that I do now as an electrophysiologist weren't even thought of when I was in training at Indiana. I mean, AFib ablation, biventricular pacing, conduction system pacing, these things weren't even thought of. So it was all stuff that I learned after Indiana. But what I got in Indiana was a solid foundation in taking care of patients in clinical medicine, but also in reviewing science and thinking about evidence critically. Really, many of my teachers at Indiana were medically conservative. They didn't call it that, but they were super medically conservative.
Where did you start your practice? Are you still in the same location, or?
So my wife and I came down to Louisville, which is 2 hours south of Indianapolis, where the med center is, and we interviewed. And I'm actually practicing electrophysiology in the same hospital that I started at in 1996. It's about a 500-bed hospital, and it's a community. It's a community hospital, but it's a big place, and
right.
Same hospital, same EP lab. Some of the same people actually are still there.
Like you, I feel very lucky to have lived through the golden age of medicine. I mean, it really was, and things have changed a lot since then. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But You used a term a minute ago that I've been interested in, and that maybe you can help us unpack for everybody else. What is a medical conservative?
The way this gets started is I really have to give one of my colleagues, Andrew Foy at Penn State. He's a cardiologist there. I really have to give him a lot of credit, because what happened is that we were at a meeting and we were reviewing this paper that was really, really hard to believe. And one of the journalists there really kind of, I would say, criticized us for our maybe skepticism that bordered on cynicism. And Andrew got really fired up, and he's like, "This is crazy." And he like typed out this PowerPoint bullet list of things that we believe. And I said, "Andrew, this is great. We need to write this up." And he's like, "Okay, fine, go ahead." And so I sort of got Vinay Prasad, who's a great
Yes.
friend and a really, really forward thinker, and his mentor, Adam Cifu at University of Chicago. And I mean, we worked on this for a number of months. And basically what a medical conservative is not a nihilist. We appreciate the progress in medicine, but we worry that some of the progress that's billed as progress is actually not really progress. And it's more or less akin to a slow adoption process and a critical appraisal of new things. And again, we incorporate new things, but when the evidence is strong, and really, I guess that's the gist of it.
Increasingly, at least in my view, I see terms like groundbreaking and revolutionary and it applied to advances that are not even necessarily proven yet. It's been reported from one center, hasn't been duplicated yet. And as you mentioned, sometimes the outcomes themselves are difficult to believe, and that should be a red flag. Let's take a closer look.
Andrew Foy and I have written a paper called "The Heavy Heart" about the economic burden of low value care in cardiology. And one of the things that we explored in the paper was the increasing amount of therapies that are on the flat part of the value curve, that are very expensive but not much value. It's kind of like an economics curve. And so as a medical conservative, we sort of feel like if we're doing more of this low value care, then that's just going to make the inequities and disparities that we have even greater. And I know some of my colleagues push back on that and will say that, a doctor is about what the patient in front of you, and there really shouldn't be any consideration of value and cost. But I don't quite agree with that. I think there's a responsibility to provide the highest value care that we can. And that really entails critically appraising the literature.
Yeah, I remember in training that I was taught the same thing. You are not to think about cost. You should put that out of your mind. What it costs the patient or the system is no concern of yours. And to some extent, I understand that. But the problem comes when the evidence that's being pushed out to practicing docs is, as you said, marginally helpful. And Vinay Prasad has talked about the same problem in oncology, how so many of the drugs extend life for 2 months or 4 months. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I mean, if I have cancer, 2 months is going to be incredibly valuable to me, but it's not enough. And is it worth the billions of dollars? And even worse, does it prevent companies from shooting for a higher bar? Because they can make billions without moving the bar much at all.
Exactly. And I would also add to that, I don't want your listeners to think that we're that being a medical conservative is anti-industry. It is absolutely not. We believe that in a free market, and we benefit from these kinds of innovation, and we don't think that a company who has a profit motive is a nefarious thing. A profit, we say in the paper that that these things, these conflicts don't need to be considered nefarious, but they do need to be considered when you're translating evidence to the bedside. And as an electrophysiologist, I've seen an amazing improvement in what we can do for people because of industry collaboration. And so we're not against that. We just worry that some of the things billed as big advances are not necessarily big advances.
It goes along with another trend that I think we're seeing more and more of, and that's, authors aren't sometimes writing their own papers, that there is somebody often from industry or hired by industry who is putting the best spin on whatever those findings are. And this gets into subgroup analysis and hedging on, what would obviously be to a scientist a negative study has now become, but if you look at it this way, there may be some value. And so it ends up getting approved. And that doesn't help any of us in terms of the equity of the distribution of medical services, or even the individual patient who goes at risk for many of these interventions and or procedures. And often they don't understand well enough the risk benefit that they are accepting in order to engage with whatever that therapy is. How do we get back to a more rigorous approach to the science of medicine?
Two important things that come to my mind is, one, I'm actually very proud to be a co-author on a paper. I'm one of the middle authors, but we actually wrote a paper. These young guys from Chicago actually looked at the literature for spin and the way we define spin. Actually, spin has been defined. Spin is anytime an author distracts from a null primary endpoint. So the study has a primary endpoint. This is what we're trying to find. It comes out non-significant. And then in the abstract or in the paper, or even in the title, there's language that distracts from that. And we found that in an incredible amount of cardiovascular literature. And so one of my goals, one of the things that overrides all the work that I do in my podcast and in my writing is to bring critical appraisal to the masses, to bring critical appraisal to patients, to doctors, to now nurse practitioners and PAs, and to really be aware of spin, be aware of critical appraisal. And that gets to your second point that you made in your comments about being able to truly inform patients about what are the benefits, what are the harms, and what are the benefits and harms if we don't do this therapy, and to get to true, I guess I would even call it what Richard Lehman, a retired GP in UK, calls a shared understanding of medicine, which is even more than shared decision making. But the tension is that the more patients understand about things, the more they may not accept what we think or what guidelines think is right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you start showing people the risk reduction from, say, a cancer screening test, we might get fewer people doing cancer screening. And so that's the tension, is when people understand the incremental value of things, it changes the calculus.
Yeah, and a lot of important stuff is embedded in what you just said, and I can think of a couple of notions that come to mind. One is relative versus absolute risk, and I'll try to explain this simply. I don't have the background that you have, the training in interpreting statistical studies, but the way I understand it is, if you're looking at relative risk, if your chances of dying are 1 in a million, and I reduce that risk 30%, that doesn't get me very far, right? It's 30% reduction from 1 in a million is still going to be 1 in some 100,000s of cases. So that's the relative risk reduction. The absolute risk reduction would be, what's your chances of dying from this, and what's your chances after the intervention of dying from this? And it's tiny if the mortality is quite small. Is that a reasonably accurate way of describing the problem?
Yeah, and the tricky part is what you just said. The tricky part is when we discuss risk reduction, it's not untruthful. It's truthful.
Right.
It's real.
Right.
But when you're talking about a relative risk reduction of, say, 20 or 30% on a very, very small risk, the absolute risk that the patient can expect, risk reduction, is much smaller. So I think the colonoscopy screening study showed a big risk reduction, and we're talking about 0.15% risk to 0.3% risk. So the absolute risk reduction is tiny. But the tricky thing, the even trickier thing, I'll extend it, is a lot of times you'll see papers that discuss relative risk reduction in terms of the benefit, but absolute risk reduction when it talks about harms. And so it's a very, very tricky thing. Yeah. So these are the tricks that I've learned over the last decade of doing this, and none of that is dishonest. It's just I guess a little bit misleading, or
and the disinterested observer is really what we need to get to. That they're not beholden to a pharmaceutical company, they're not beholden to a delivery system. That they are truly free to assess both the outcome and the value in a reasonable way. Now, they have to be trained in statistical analysis. One of the things that shocked me as statistics get more and more complicated and more strategies and techniques are used to do that, you can come up with wildly different outcomes on the same data set, depending on which statistical strategies you use to assess it. How does that work? How is that possible, first of all, and what does it mean?
This makes me so excited to talk about this. First of all, I think the disinterested observer, I call it the neutral Martian. If a Martian looked at this data, what would the Martian think? And my view, sometimes the Martian would just shake his head and be like, like my grandfather used to just shake his head like, what are you guys doing? But okay, so this, let's call it flexibility, an analytic method. And you have to give credit to Brian Nosek, Noseck. He's at the University of Virginia, published this unbelievable paper, I think in 2018. And what they did is such an amazing story, is they had this one data set of European soccer leagues. And their question was a social science question. Their question was, do referees give more red cards to dark-skinned players? And they had this incredibly large data set. And what Brian Nosek's idea was, he's going to bring 28 teams of data scientists, and they're going to ask that one question: Is there dark skin bias towards red cards? And the data teams could analyze the data set in any way they wanted. They could choose the covariates, they can choose the statistical test. And what's so interesting is they chose like 28 different ways, and 2/3 of the time it was significant, and 1/3 of the time it wasn't significant. And the thing of it is when you read a paper in a medical journal, they don't analyze the data set 28 different ways. They analyze it one way.
Yep.
Your listeners may be like, well, throw up their hands like, how could we ever know? And the thing that we write in the medical conservative paper is that truly beneficial therapies don't require like huge statistical analysis. They're obvious. As a critical care physician, I mean, you know some of these things, and opening a closed artery during a heart attack, I mean, it's obviously beneficial, and the trials show that. But I mean, and that's what we're talking about on that flat part of the curve. The steep part of the curve are things that are you don't require a lot of these fancy analyses for.
You don't need to go through a lot of statistical contortions when the outcome is clear. Is that another way of saying?
As a regular person looking at a study, I mean, if it's clearly beneficial, you can tell. And I think that there are times when statistical analysis help us decide whether something is true signal or noise. But truly beneficial, high value things are rarely something that are sensitive to any statistics.
The other notion that seems intuitively okay, I remember one of your posts, you talked about a study that turned out to not be significant, and you said, well, what if we looked at this subset? After the study's done, You say, what if we looked at this? Why is that a problem?
Yeah, that's a huge problem, because in science, when you learn science as a young person, you ask a question and you design an experiment to answer that question, and you then look at the data and how it bears on that question. But once you've looked at the data, you can't just pick out a subset that you like, because it's going to be likely just a play of chance. I'll tell a brief story. When I practiced in EP for 10 years before looking at any study and before doing anything academic, and I got this wild hair that I wanted to do a study on some of our ablation experience at our hospital. And I had this theory that women did worse than men, and so we got all our data and retrospectively analyzed it, and it turned out that it wasn't statistically significant. And we had this young statistician. I mean, he was so young. Sean, his name was. And I said, Sean, okay, but I think if we look at this group, and Sean, I was a cardiologist and 40 years old, and he looked at me with his face. I'm like, what's the matter, Sean? What's the matter? It's like, you saw a ghost. And he goes, Dr. Mandrola, you can't do that. And I was like, Sean, I'm a cardiologist. Come on, I can do this stuff. And so I said, let's call Dr. Mann. And Dr. Mann was my senior partner, and he was in academics for like 20 years. We call up Dr. Mann, we put him on speakerphone. I tell him what I want to do, and David Mann says, no, Sean is right, John. You can't do that. I wanted to make a reasonable subgroup, but we couldn't do it because we'd already had the data. And, a trial is powered to answer that question. And if you break it up into little data groups, you're likely to get, noise rather than signal.
Got it. And when you say
there's a famous trial called ISIS-2. ISIS-2 looked at aspirin in heart attacks, and this Richard Pito from UK, they showed that aspirin was beneficial in heart attacks, one of the landmark seminal trials. But the editors of Lancet wanted to know which subgroups benefited more from aspirin or benefited less. And Pito said, no, we're not splitting up the data. And Lancet said, okay, we're not publishing the study. So they decided to break it up into certain subgroups, but they added one subgroup by astrological sign. And they found out that aspirin was highly beneficial for 2 astrological signs, but not the other ones, or vice versa. And they actually published that in the Lancet. And so if you just Google ISIS-2 and Richard Pito, P-E-T-O, you'll find that he showed so elegantly that if you break up subgroups, you can find anything. And astrological sign, of course, has nothing to do with aspirin efficacy. So it's a beautiful story.
I'm convinced that there's a marketer out there somewhere who's ready to market aspirin to those 2 subpopulations,
yes,
astrological signs. It does get kind of daunting if even for physicians who often have about enough time to read the headline, which you have mentioned often has spin in it. They might look at the discussion or something like that, but that's not a reliable place to find out if it was a rigorous study, because the discussion can be colored by the same sorts of spin that you find on the headline.
More so.
What is a practitioner to do in order to do a better job of making sure that they're not getting fooled?
First of all, have a sort of prior expectation and understand the forces that are at play here. And it's not nefarious, but you have to understand the forces. And then you kind of have to look at a study. And when I look at a study, I sort of read, I read what they did, and I read the methods, I read how they did it. And then the second thing I read is the limitations paragraph. Some journals will put the limitations in the abstract, but I read the limitations, and most observational studies or non-random comparisons are going to be, we didn't have randomized comparisons. We made adjustments, but we don't really know. And then I look at the results, and literally the last thing I read is the discussion section.
Because you don't want to be biased by it. Is that the idea?
And again, it's not nefarious, right? The evidence generators are they want to find positive findings. They're interested in it. They want to do good for society. They want to do
Yep.
good for their career. You don't really get formal training in this. And I think it's just a practice that you have to get used to. The other thing that I would say to practitioners that's a really good resource is in these guideline documents. If you go to a guideline document and you read the narrative review of the evidence, and if there's some way to blank out these little colored boxes that try and make medicine so simple, and you read the evidence review and you go look at the references, that's another way. When we have learners come on our service, like for AFib, we just read the guidelines, read the narrative reviews, don't really look at the recommendations, just read the evidence. And so this is one of my goals, is to bring this to the masses.
What a laudable goal, because it can get us so far off track if we start. It reminds me of the Richard Feynman quote, "The first rule is not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool." Confirmation bias, self-interest, these are human being natural tendencies. As you said, it's not nefarious. It is who we are as creatures that we have to fight against, or we're bound to fool ourselves. That's the way I think about it.
When I started cardiology, when we had an MI, a heart attack patient in the ICU who was having ventricular ectopy, arrhythmia from the ventricle, we knew that those PVCs associated with bad outcomes, because there were observational studies that showed if you have this, you're going to do bad. And then on the other hand, we had drugs that suppressed those PVCs. And when I started, everybody got antiarrhythmics if they had this ectopy. And this persisted for 10 years. We were treating people because we thought we were doing the right thing. And then these brave researchers decided to do a trial of antiarrhythmics versus nothing. And it turned out that by a factor of 3%, we were killing people with these antiarrhythmics. The number needed to kill patients with antiarrhythmics, an established dogma, was 29. So for every 29 patients we treated, we killed one by what we believed. And so when I'm reviewing studies, I have this historical knowledge that one of our major practices that you could not even question ended up being dead wrong.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's not the only example. It's a great one. But, think about Zygris, which was very popular for sepsis for a long time. Or you think about bone marrow transplant for breast cancer, a disproven therapy that probably killed a lot of people before we, figured that out. It's not that anybody is trying to do harm. It's just that we have to be very, very careful when we're putting people at risk. The onus is on whoever is suggesting a difference in strategy. The onus is on them to prove it.
I couldn't agree more. And again, I don't want listeners to think that it's cynical. It's just you get enthusiastic and you're trying to help people. And you have to have sort of the lessons from history that, again, if we have that, that's like a tenet of the medical conservative. You have evidence that this works, fine. But if it makes sense, you should be very suspicious.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Well, yeah, I want to be mindful of your time. You've been very generous with me so far, and I do have a couple more questions that I want to ask you though, and the first is I want listeners to know, one of the things that I rely on a day-to-day basis is, first of all, your posts and your engagement on social media is fantastic. But there's something called Sensible Medicine now, and you were one of the co-founders of that. Can you describe what that is and how people can access it?
Yeah, so Sensible Medicine is a Substack. It's a newsletter. And so you just go to Sensible Medicine Substack and it'll come up. And along with a number of colleagues, what we thought is to bring sort of evidence, critical appraisal, but also one of our goals is to allow debate, because we're all fans of Christopher Hitchens, who famously said that time spent in debate is almost never wasted. And One of the things that we worry about with the journals, with medical meetings, is that there's sort of a gated narrative that's allowed. And what we propose in Sensible Medicine, and our goal is to allow debate, not in a cynical way, but in a skeptical way. And so I do a post every Monday about critical appraisal, and Vinay is obviously an expert, and Adam is a thoughtful internist at University of Chicago, and we get guest posts from people, and we sort of want it to be a place where people can be sensible and be debate, and we cannot dislike each other for having different opinions.
Right. You debate the ideas. You don't attack the people who have the ideas, right?
And really, the podcast that I host with Medscape called This Week in Cardiology, a lot of people give me feedback and say, John, we can't get that in a journal, or we can't get that in a medical meeting. And, I'm sort of a neutral Martian. I have a private practice. I don't have any drug company relationships. I don't do big trials.
One of the things that I appreciate about how you do it, John, is you do it in a way that is non-confrontational and just sticks to the reality of the facts. And I really appreciate that. And I'm sure lots of others do as well. Not to say that we don't need folks to be confrontational, because sometimes you need that, to get change. But I appreciate your style. I appreciate the way you write and the way you present the information. How else might folks, latch on to all that you write? Is it all on Sensible Medicine now, or in the meds?
I would say, number one, I'm pretty active on Twitter. I know people have mixed feelings about Twitter, but I think I'm at Dr. John M. on Twitter, and I pretty much there every day. I am a chief cardiology correspondent for Medscape, so I have a column there called Trials and Fibrillation. We host a podcast that comes out every Friday called This Week in Cardiology. I have my own Substack called Stop and Think, and I write quite a bit for Sensible Medicine, and those are the places.
Thank you so much for what you're doing to right the ship of healthcare. I really thought that we'd have time to spend on other specific examples, but maybe for another time. I don't want to unnecessarily take up your time, and I think we've covered the waterfront pretty well. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you think's important for folks to know right now?
There's so much, and I think an hour is good, and I think I really appreciate talking to you, and I'm grateful you had me on.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And with that, we're going to conclude today's session and say so long.
You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on The Groves Connection.